What's up, rampaging dinosaurs of the internet? Hi, I'm Peter. I am a writer, the publisher behind Brainjar Press, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be working in ebooks and in the long tail over the long term. So, I've been around the indie publishing scene for a really long time now. I wasn't part of the first wave of fiction publishers that grew out of the launch of the Amazon Kindle in 2007. I actually started a few years before that in the RPG industry during the D20 boom, when ebooks kind of had this real moment and saw a swell of sort of small indie publishers. So this is actually the very first ebook I ever released. It is a small product aimed at Dungeons and Dragons players. It's probably about 20 pages long, maximum. It came out in 2005. So it is 16 years old at this point. And I think often when people look at indie publishing, they get really swept up in the immediacy of it, the ability to get their book out now, but the real power of it is actually a long-term thing. So that book is 16 years old. And just to put it in context, I'm no longer active in the RPG space. I don't write for RPGs anymore. I barely get a chance to play RPGs anymore, and when I do, it's very rarely Dungeons and Dragons. So I don't have a particularly active or vocal audience there. I don't do a lot of marketing in that kind of space. More importantly, that book is available at a single retailer called Drive-Thru RPG, which was the big early adopter of RPG ebooks in 2003, 2004, right? And even with all of that, even with me not being active, being very much out of the scene, more importantly, with that book being written for an edition of D&D that is now 2.5 editions out of date, most of the player base has moved on. Most people are playing 5th edition now or have moved on to Pathfinder, which is itself now in a 2nd edition. Even with all of that, every month or so, I get a little notification saying, hey, you sold another copy of that book. 16 years old, and it still earns me this little tiny trickle of income every month. And that's small, The profit on that book is only about $1. But when you add it up and move it over the length of your entire backlist, when you think about what that means over the course of 15 years, we're just getting $1 a month for each book. When you look at, when I look at the kind of work that I'm doing now, the kinds of books that I'm putting out through Brainjar Press, the kind of work that I'm doing as a writer, and start thinking about, okay, so this book has launched and it has not done as well as I may have hoped, but that's fine, because that book is going to be for sale for 15, 20 years. Realistically speaking, it could be for sale for my entire lifetime and then 75 years of copyright afterwards, delivering money to my heirs if they manage things right. It is entirely conceivable that that book will continue to earn money for me for decades to come. And it may not be a lot of money, but as I produce new books, as I'm more active in the spaces that I am, as I find new fiction readers, that slow trickle of income starts to add up. When you produce enough books, when you have a solid backlist that is sitting there selling over time, and particularly when you aggregate out the number of sales that you get for each product year after year after year, that starts to add up to a fairly decent amount of money, right? And this is a huge thing to wrap your head around when you first start out as a writer or as a publisher. The money that you get for a book or for a story or for anything else up front is really just a small portion of the overall value of that work. When you start thinking long term, and when I say long term, I'm not thinking 1 or 2 years, I'm thinking 2 or 3 decades. When you start thinking about all the ways in which you could be still earning money from this work long after you've started focusing on other things, there is an enormous amount of power to indie publishing and ebooks and that long tail and that ability to have access to everything that you've ever written. A reader who finds your work and loves it now can still go back and find the things that you wrote 10, 20, 30 years ago and pick it up. And that's actually a really new thing. It's a thing that publishing itself is still grappling with. That idea that your backlist was readily available, that it wasn't just going to sit on a shelf for a month and then the next wave of books would wipe it away, is really only something that's been around for about 10 to 15 years. And we're still figuring out what it means as writers and as publishers and as people involved in the bookselling industry. It's a really exciting time, but Don't get swept up in the excitement. Don't get swept up in the now. Think long term. 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Your books always have the potential to do well